Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Cuffle. I know it's been a while since my last video, but today I wanted to make a video talking about a subject that is very important to me and is one of the biggest reasons why I didn't end up converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. And that's the essence energies distinction in God. We'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about some of the debates that happened within the 14th century in the Byzantine Church, especially between Barlaam and Gregory Palamas. We'll also be talking about the Western view of created grace and the beatific vision, and some of the arguments on why me personally, I end up rejecting this doctrine, and an examination of a lot of the fathers that supposedly reject, or supposedly embrace this distinction, which I don't end up thinking that most of them do. So as we're going through this, I just have a couple sheets of printed out stuff because I want to, so if you see me looking down, it's because I am reading off notes for some of these things because I haven't memorized all these things. I have like 10 pages of things I want to talk about, and I don't want to end up forgetting things and having to re-edit them in later. So the first couple things I'm going to end up reading off because it's kind of just a history of the lives of Gregory Palamas and Barlaam, and I want to give a special shout out to, well, I guess I don't really need to shout him out, but I want to thank him very much for his videos. He is Proto-Presbyter Maxime Lysak of Christ the Savior Orthodox Church in Ottawa, Ontario. He has done videos on the essence energies distinction and Gregory Palamas and Barlaam, and even though we would end up taking different sides on this debate, certainly because he is a Eastern Orthodox like archpriest or high priest, and I am a Western confessional Lutheran, I deeply respect him for these videos. They are very educational, they are very important, and they provided a lot of information that I couldn't get other sources. So even though we would end up taking different perspectives on this, I want to give a really big shout out to him and a really big thank you, because I think he provided some really invaluable resources, which I deeply appreciated as someone looking into this issue really for maybe the second time. I did a light examination of it maybe about a year ago, but I've been doing a deep dive on it because I wanted to make a video about it, and I really want to say thank you to him so much. So now let's get into it. So who is Gregory Palamas? He lived between 1296 and 1359. He was from I'm not gonna say they're rich, but from a more aristocratic family, a higher up family within society. He had a secondary and post-secondary education. He was very educated, very smart man. It was a type of classical education, and it also had a lot of immersion in philosophy and in the classics, and specifically for him within a lot of Aristotelian metaphysics and philosophy under Theodore Metohides, who at the time was one of the best Aristotelian scholars and teachers of the time. So an incredible education. This would be like in America going to probably like MIT or Stanford and studying under the best professors. He's absolutely a brilliant person, and even though I disagree with him, I have to respect his level of education, certainly. After his father passed away, he ended up convincing his two sisters, the servants of the family, because they were aristocratic, and his two brothers, and they all ended up joining monasteries, and Gregory ended up going to Mount Athos, which is, as we now know, is one of the most holy mountains within Orthodoxy. It's where a lot of monastics end up going. It's a very sacred place. He was there for quite a long time, but he ended up having to leave for Thessalonica because Mount Athos, I apologize, ended up being attacked by Turkish pirates. This has happened multiple times in history. And in that time, it was actually really important because he ended up becoming a student of Isidore, who was a disciple of St. Gregory of Sinai, who was also a very prominent hesychastic defender. It is probably unlikely that they ended up meeting in person at any point, but they were the two Gregorys that defended hesychasm. And he was ordained to the priesthood at about 30, which was pretty standard for that time. I believe it's one of the youngest that can be in the canons, but nowadays that rule isn't always followed. And in 1336, he founded a hermitage on his own with extremely rigorous prayer routines. They were in serious prayer for hours and hours, about 5 days a week, and then 2 days were communal days. So he had an extremely rigorous monastery that he ran. And then after this, he later did return to Mount Athos within his lifetime. Now, the other person who ends up to be Gregory Palamas' opponent is Barlaam of Calabria. And one of the things that's important was he was Greek. He was from Calabria, which I believe is in Italy, but he was from a culturally Greek place where most people, they were Orthodox, even though it was in a kind of Western, Roman area, they ended up being Orthodox. But something that important was he was Western educated. So a lot of his ideas of things ended up being more Western, such as, at the time, something relevant within his education would be like Thomism. Like that was kind of the philosophy of the time, because even people that are not studied in theology know who St. Thomas Aquinas is. He's a great defender of what I think to be truth about the doctrines of God. Certainly got things wrong, absolutely. But a great defender and a strong use of philosophy to defend the Christian faith. So he was linguistically Greek and an Orthodox Christian, but he received a lot of Western education. He was humanism, a type of humanism was very popular at the time, so him and some of his followers, like Nicephorus and Gregory Palamas, they also were a type of humanist. They were quite Neoplatonic in their thinking, and this is not itself a bad thing. It can manifest as some problems, but within the Christian tradition, there's always been a more there's different perspectives on more use of Aristotle or more use of Plato and things. For example, like Saint Anselm was very Neoplatonic in his thinking. I believe Augustine as well, but you see someone like Gregory Palamas or Thomas who is very influenced by Aristotle and thought. So that's just something to be observed about him, which will be important later on in our thinking. He was also a scholar of Pseudo-Dionysius. For those who don't know, Pseudo-Dionysius the writings were originally attributed to a man named Dionysius, who was a very, very early church person. Like he would have been someone that knew Paul, that knew Timothy. These letters were attributed to him, but with later scholarship, it was shown that these were writings probably in the 5th to 6th century by a monastic who we don't know. So we call him Pseudo-Dionysius, and he really emphasizes the unknowability of God, how other God is. And that's not a wrong thing to say, because that is true. There is a lot of unknowability in God. We can't fully explain him. We can only kind of, in some ways, and explain what he's not, and that's something called apathetic theology, explaining God by what he's not. This is something you see at the ecumenical councils, where it's not a precise, this is some people will argue that, but what it is it's, when talking about the natures of Christ, right? There isn't an exact parsing out of everything, but like at the Council of Chalcedon, we say he has two natures. Now, within that, Eastern Orthodox hold to that, Roman Catholics hold to that, Lutherans hold to that, Reformed, all Protestants hold to that, but how those things end up working themselves out in that end up being slightly different. Like if you look at the Lutheran doctrine of how the divine nature kind of penetrates the human nature, how it works through it, where the Reformed have a much more strict sense of them being separate, and they're both Chalcedonian, but they're just a difference in how we interpret them and in how we see them working out. But they can both fit. So, but Chalcedon was doing something. And this is about all the councils with apathetic theology, making sure, okay, we're not saying exactly what is, because we can never fully know, because God is a mystery. Even the incarnation is a mystery. All parts of God, in some way, not parts of God, aspects. God as a whole is a mystery, and we're trying to parse these things out. But there are certain things that are so wrong that we have to say, no, that's definitely wrong. And using this, we can. This is more right. But it's not perfect, because we're using philosophy, so it's not a perfect system, but it's the best we can do to prevent against total erroneous ideas. For example, of monophysitism, and meophysitism is a different debate, but we can talk about that in a different video. I apologize for going off on a rant a little bit, but he was really the first one to really introduce this idea of apathetic theology heavily into theology, and That's a very important not addition, a very important gift to the church, I'll say. So yeah, he was a scholar of Pseudo-Dionysius, so he shows the unknowability of God. He later returned to Constantinople and to experience more of orthodoxy, to get, well, this is my church. Let me really see what it's like here. What's going on here? What is the academy like in the Byzantine Empire and stuff like that? Let's see what's going on. And he was at first like very welcome. People liked him when he went to Constantinople. They're like, this Western scholar, like he's awesome. Like that's amazing. And he wanted to understand more about the monastic life. So he ended up visiting many monasteries, including Mount Athos, because that's the most famous one, of course. And what he saw there horrified him. He was scandalized by what he saw. He asked the monks, and he saw them, praying and meditating. And he asked what they were doing, what type of practices they were doing. And the monks told them about the uncreated light and a type of unceasing prayer. For Barlaam, unceasing prayer was the conscious knowledge that nothing is done without God's will, without His providence. And that you cannot speak of the essence or energy of God. We cannot, because then we would have knowledge of the energies. Because he says, from Barlaam's perspective, the essence and the energies are absolutely identical. This is the Thomist position. This is the Western position. So when he hears the monks say they are experiencing the uncreated energies, in his mind, he's saying the monks are saying they're experiencing the very essence, which is definitely heretical. That's how he hears it, because he's Western educated. He doesn't hear, because there's not really this clear, there's not really this clear distinction in the fathers and in the earlier church, that there's this real distinction somehow between God's essence and energies. So he hears this and he's like, pardon me? What did you just say to me? I must be hearing things. So he continues to ask more. He also considered experiences of God, because the monks explained seeing this uncreated light, the same light that was at the Mount of Tabor when Jesus Christ was transfigured. And he considered experiences of God to be more objective, such as sense, imagination, and logical processes, such as God's appearances in the Old Testament, not the more personal experience of experiencing this uncreated light that the monks had. And he argues that in prayer, the mind of a man distances itself from the body and is not enclosed with it. This is kind of a debate within regards to prayer, which I'm not going to be covering as much in this video. If you want, I can do a separate video with regards to that, but I'm going to skip over that kind of for now, because it's not as relevant. And he believed that the only time we really interact with God unmediatedly was once we were in heaven. And he's talking about kind of the beatific vision, which everyone ends up affirming, kind of. In the West, where more emphasis on it. The East, they end up actually rejecting it, because they say we always experience the uncreated energies, both on earth and in heaven, but we never in any way interact with the essence. Where in the West, and I'll talk about the beatific vision a little bit later on, where we say, no, we do kind of intellectually grasp some way the essence, not what's going on inside the Holy Trinity, but we kind of grasp the essence in some way, but not by a physical sight either. All right. But the way these two end up kind of finally interconnecting or intermingling was for two things. Two things happened. He ended up attacking the monks, not physically, obviously, but intellectually and theologically. He says that them saying that the essences and the energies are distinct is heretical, that they are heretics for doing that they are Milesians, however you want to pronounce it, for believing that. He attacks the use of prayer, seeing the having the mind kind of in the navel when meditating, and this type of uncreated light, seeing that he's like, no, that's not what Scripture says. That's not what the Father said. That you, through this type of meditation, you encounter the divine energies, even though he thinks the energies in essence are the same, that you would interact with them in that way. And the other thing he's critiqued it for, and this is where pseudo-Dionysius and being a scholar, and that comes into play, is he was also a critiquer of the Latin Church. He ended up converting to Catholicism after these debates and after he was excommunicated from the Eastern Orthodox Church. But before that, he was writing treatises against the Filioque. And one of his things that he says was, well, you shouldn't believe in the Filioque because we can't know if the Spirit proceeds from the Son. He could, but because of God's unknowability, we actually can't know if the Spirit proceeds from the Son. And Gregory Palamas did not like this answer. He said, no, we can definitely know that it doesn't proceed from the Son. Once again, I'm going to disagree, but that's their debate that they're having. So Barlaam ends up taking this position of, well, it's unknowable, so you shouldn't hold to it. But Gregory says, no, we can know that it's wrong for certain. So you shouldn't hold to it for that. So they kind of come in contact because of these two things happening. So, and then I want to give a quick introduction. Because a lot of people misunderstand where the essence energies distinction comes from in Gregory Palamas. It comes from the idea, and what he's trying to defend here, is that he's trying to preserve two truths. One, that God is utterly transcendent and unknowable in some way, which everyone ends up affirming in some way. Even people that affirm to the beatific vision, we still don't know what's going on in the inner life of the Trinity. Okay? And the second one is that God is also knowable in some way and resides within us and interacts with the world through unmediated means. That we don't receive created gifts or created graces in some way. It's really God unmediatedly interacting with us in some way. So he has to come up with this idea where I don't want to say come up with this idea. I'm not trying to be debative yet. I'm just trying to do a historical review, so I apologize. That it is God's energies, which he is fully in, that we receive. So there's no mediation between us and God. We receive God directly through the divine energies. I don't know if that makes sense. Because a lot of people end up looking at this and like, how do you come to that conclusion of like the essence energies distinction? Because that's what I was struggling with. I was like, how do you end up coming to that conclusion? But it's really a debate about how we receive the gifts from God that then prompts Gregory Palamas to write about the essence energies distinction in this way. Okay, so then let's do a quick overview of the energies. What are the energies? What is the essence of God? The essence of God is pretty simple. The essence, and sometimes you hear the word essence, nature, substance, all mean the same thing here, is what God is in himself. Who God is, basically. The energies in the East are how God exists and acts in the world, and also how we know him. In the West, we're going to say we agree on the how we know him and act in the world and stuff, but we're not going to say those are distinct from his nature or his essence. So these are God's actions within like if you want to put it other way, like the economic trinity, you know, his actions within the history of saving the world in that way. So what are some of the properties of the energies? The energies are uncreated, meaning they are not created within time. Because if they were, the East says, well, if they were created, then you don't have this unmediated connection with God. You're receiving it through the physical world in some way. So you're not really receiving God in that way. They are eternal for the most part, which we'll get into later. So that means they've always been there. We understand that. Since God is endless, his energies and actions have also been endless. And his potential to act is endless. They are fully divine. So each energy is fully God. This is really important because if it's not, then it ends up being some weird hybrid thing where it's like half God, but God can't be somewhere half, so it ends up having to be fully created or fully God. The East says they are fully God. Each God is fully within each of the energies. They are not creatures or created things, obviously, as we talked about. They are not symbols of something. They don't just appear as something or symbolize something to come or symbolize some other form of receiving the energy. They are what they are. And they are not intermediaries to something else. The energies aren't carrying something to you. The energies are what you receive. And they are still truly God, which is the most important aspect for the East, because they want to have this heavy emphasis on you are truly interacting and receiving something from God that is fully God. Let me see here. Oh, I apologize. I put that page down by accident. So the energies are also they are attributes of God manifested through the energies. So some examples of them are grace, love, mercy, compassion, wisdom, power, life, sanctification, glory, all these things, which are transferred to humans through the energies in the world. And there's two analogies, and don't get super scientifically technical about them, but these are two good analogies that talk about the essence, that are a good example of the essence energies. One of them is a very famous one. It's the sun analogy. That says like God is like the sun, and the rays of the sun are like the energies, where of course the rays of the sun don't exist without the sun, neither do the energies exist without God. So they're not this separate thing. There's something that proceeds from it, but it's still one thing. It's not two different things that are composite. It's one singularity in that way. Another one is fire. Heat proceeds forth from fire. Heat doesn't exist without the fire. In the same way, the energies don't exist without God. Once again, one singularity. And there's some examples of them that they say are from Scripture, that these are really the energies working throughout the world. One is, of course, going to be the Taboric light, what Jesus' transfiguration, the burning bush, on Damascus Road with St. Paul. They say those are the energies working, that they saw Christ, that they saw and heard the voice of Christ. That these are God's energies and a real manifestation of divine life. And by divine life, because Gregory Palamas uses this a lot, divine life refers to participation in God and experiencing God himself through the energies, of course, which are fully God. Orthodox argue that what we participate in cannot be created, because if it were, like I was saying earlier, they say they can't be, we would not truly participate in God, and union with God would be through indirect means. God is entirely present in each of the divine energies, although it is clear he transcends all of them. And this is where it starts to get a little funky, in my opinion. We'll come into that later, though, when I do some critiquing of this doctrine. So each energy is not partially God. It's not, because you can't have part of God. It's not some weird mixture. It's not an intermediary. God is fully present in each of the energies, so you're receiving him through the energies. But the essence also ends up transcending the energies, which I do think later becomes a problem. But I understand what they're saying. They're not trying to say these in the same way that the emanations of light or heat from the fire or the sun cannot possibly transcend the sun or the fire itself, because that's what it's proceeding forth from. I'm not proceeding the same way of like the spirit. Let me clarify, I'm not meaning that, but it cannot possibly be greater than that, because it's necessary. It only emanates because it's from that, so it cannot possibly be greater than that. So I understand what he's saying here. I do think it leads to some issues, but we'll take it at face value for now. But another thing that's important is they claim that the energies, even though they're working through things in these physical things, the burning bush, the Taboric light, which are physical things that are seen through eyes, physical eyes, they do not have physicality in themselves, and they end up working through physical things to be seen, or like the burning bush, but they don't in themselves have a physicality. and the question is, are there any examples of divine things being non-physical? Because that's the first question I had. I was like, I can't think of anything else. Actually, yeah, angels. They don't have physical properties, but they're, divine, not in the same way God is, but yeah, they're angelic creatures. So yeah, something can be non-physical, and yeah. So, and this essence energy distinction is also very important for theosis, because that participating in God language is what it's entirely based on. Without it, you cannot really have theosis in the way that East talks about, when you have a absolute divine simplicity perspective. I know in the West there's a type of Christification. Jordan Cooper talks about this. I understand that, but in the same way that East talks about it, you can't have it, because there's a necessity of the partaking of the divine energies, which are fully God in Himself. So that kind of ends up being like essence energy's exclusive position. Orthodox claim that doesn't split God into parts, even though you have this essence and energies where it is separated. They're going to say the energies are just how God exists and manifests in the world. There's not this two-ness in God, from their perspective. We'll get to that argument, but that it's still one, in the same way that the rays aren't a second part of the sun in some way. They just emanate from it, but we can get into that later. And of course, they say there's no composite in God, and that just because they'll say this, there's a distinction in God, but that doesn't mean there's parts in God. Okay, you say that. I don't know if that's fully true, but we can talk about that later on. I'm just saying what the East says. That's what they say. And so here's a couple other things that I want to go over real quick, and then we can get into a little bit more technical stuff, some of what Gregory Palamas says in the triad, some of the fathers, other stuff like that. The energy travels to us from the Father through the Son in the Holy Spirit. Of course, not from the Son to the Holy Spirit, because they reject the filioque. And they also say that it helps. The essence energies distinction helps to overcome some types of Platonic dualism, where the physical world is seen as bad, and the spiritual world is seen as good. Since the divine energies have gone through all of creation, it can't possibly be that position with the type of dualism. So I think it does successfully work in overcoming that. And they also feel that it is the only proper way to defend a true sense of Christian mysticism with this participation language. And they see the West as kind of just like, with the use of specifically Catholicism, with the use of a created grace or an intermediary way of receiving them. They're like, that's not it. That's so legalistic they would just say it's wrong generally. I don't want to go too far into that, because I'm not a Roman Catholic scholar on the created graces, to be honest. I'm just a 20-year-old kid. And then after the 1347 council, where this issue got debated a couple times back and forth at councils, it was officially taken as the position of the church, and historians will just agree on this, Orthodox ones, non-Orthodox ones, it kind of lost a lot of prominence. It really wasn't talked about, and even for a while, types of Thomism were very popular in the Eastern Church, but it had a revival in the early 1900s, and especially among Greek and Russian Orthodox Christians. So for a while, it really wasn't, you didn't really have this talk within the laity, at least, and even within the clergy. It was very popular among the monks for all of its existence, but you didn't really have this talk about hesychia, hesychasm, and this type of essence energies distinction and participating in the divine energies. This really wasn't common language until quite recently within history, which now, all the Orthodox converts are constantly talking about, which I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm glad that they were able to recover their theology that they, doctrinally defined at a council. I'm glad they didn't just forget about it, but I do think it ends up being wrong. and it just, historically speaking, it wasn't prominent throughout the history of the church. One other short thing that I wanted to clarify, because I'm going to talk about this a little bit. It's not a major thing, but it's kind of just a definition thing that I want to clear up, is that I want to talk about essence versus either super essence or super essentiality. Gregory Palamas will say essence and essentiality, and then super essential or super essence in some way. All this really means is that the essence, what we talked about earlier, who God is in himself, but super essentiality is also talking about the idea that God isn't just an essence. He's more than an essence, and that goes to that kind of more mysterious side of God, which isn't wrong. I affirm that God is super essential in a way that he isn't just an essence or a substance. He's something so much greater than that we can never fully know. But I just want to clarify that point, because he does talk about that, and it can be a little confusing on like the first time I heard that I was like, what does that even mean? It just clarifies that God isn't just one philosophical like substance or nature. He's so much greater than that we can never truly know. All right, so here I just have had because I have read fully the triads, and I wrote down some quotes that usually later on in the book that I wanted to talk about because they're relevant for my later critiques, and there's something that I want to clarify, so I'm not just, people don't think I'm just strawmanning Gregory Palamas, but this is really what he is saying. And I'll have a little bit of critiques in here, but I'm going to try to save most of that for afterwards. So one thing is he really likes pseudodiagnosis. This is one phrase he just used, and I'm not critiquing his use of pseudodiagnosis, of course, but I just think it's funny. He says, pseudodiagnosis, or Dionysius, we just calls him in the book, that unerring contemplator of intelligible things says, and then they talked about the superessentiality of God in that context. Another quote is, forgiven the multitude of divine energies. So there isn't just, in the same way like we think about like emotions in God, because of course God doesn't have emotions, but how God acts and we interpret them as justice or wrath or happiness or whatever and that's how we interpret it. It's not that God has the essence and the energies, and then the energies are all the same, but we interpret them differently based on how God acts, or how we perceive that God is acting. It's that the energies themselves are different from each other. The energy of glory and the energy of deification and the energy of sanctification and the energy of love are in themselves substantially different from each other, which is going to be something I have a problem with later on. But so he is saying that. How could God subsist entirely in each without any division at all, and how could each provide him with a name and manifest him entirely, thanks to the indivisible and supernatural simplicity, if he did not transcend all the energies? So here all he ends up saying is that the energies are actually distinct from one another, and that God's essence transcends the energies. I talked about this earlier, but I wanted to have a quote in here because I don't want people to think I'm strawmanning Gregory Palamas. So he's just clarifying that. Another one is, and this I talked about this earlier, he is entirely manifest in every energy. So every energy of God, of all the ones I named and all the ones I've not named, he is entirely, fully, 100% there, which is just relevant for my later arguments. And I want you to know that. All right. Okay, this is another one. There are, however, energies of God which have a beginning and an end, as all the saints will confirm. Our opponents think that everything which has a beginning is created. So he's saying some of the energies temporally do begin and do end. Okay? Sorry, I just got lost where I was. Which have a beginning and an end, as all the saints will confirm. Our opponent thinks that everything which has a beginning is created. And then on the next page, St. Maximus says that goodness and all that the word implies, all life, absolutely all immortality, I apologize, and all the attributes that pertain essentially to God are works of God and do not have a temporal beginning. So, I apologize, I kind of read that as one thing. But there should be kind of a space. So, our opponent thinks that everything which has a beginning is created. That's what he's saying. And on the next page, Gregory Palamas quotes St. Maximus on that. trying to defend this, or with having a separate quote, I apologize, on a different topic. And St. Maximus says, and I don't know why he ends up using this quote because it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if I've totally misinterpreted what he's saying here, but it doesn't make any sense for his argument. St. Maximus says, goodness and all that the word implies, absolutely all immortality, and all the attributes that pertain essentially to God, which would be the energies in this case, because if not, then of course in the East you would have, without the energies, you have no way to participate in God, are works of God and do not have a temporal beginning. So this quote from St. Maximus the Confessor says that, no, the works are infinite. So I don't know how Gregory Palamas is going to say that some of them have a temporal beginning in time. But anyways, okay. And then here is a, sometimes Gregory Palamas makes a point and he thinks he made a really good point, and it just isn't. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is one of them. There's two of them on here where he says something and he thinks he really cooked with it, and he really didn't. So he says this: when God was conversating with Moses, he did not say, I am the essence, but I am the one who is. Thus, it is not the one who derives from the essence, but the essence which derived from him. For it is he who contains all being in himself. So he's critiquing Barlaam by saying the essence and energies are the same here. And he's like, well, God didn't say I am the essence. Well, do you know what, Gregory? He also didn't say that, like, you know, you are currently experiencing me through the divine energies, through the created, through uncreated mediums in the physical world, proceeding forth from my superessentiality. So, sorry, Gregory, that argument isn't relevant here. I saw what you tried to do, but it didn't work. We caught what you did. Don't try that ever again. But he does. Here he's just being a bit of a dick. If only your eyes, blind as they are, saying this to Barlaam, to this light that the saints behold, would teach you that it is not a natural light, nor visible through the medium of air. So this is an important point because he talks about this. He's saying the uncreated energies, when they were seen, specifically at the Taboric light, when there's the glory of God around him, and it's a light emanating and it blinds the disciples. He's saying it's not just visible through a medium of air. Even in the endless, in heaven, we will see this Taboric light, this glory, and participate in it. My problem with his statement there is that all the examples that we've seen in the Bible, in the burning bush, if you want to say that, in the Damascus road for Paul, at the Taboric light, they were through the physical medium of air. So your argument isn't relevant because it's not like you've seen it in a space where there isn't the medium of air or physical mediums. So he makes this point that it doesn't require any physical medium, but he never has an example of it being shown in a non-physical medium. So I think it ends up just being a moot point. But he makes this point repeatedly throughout the book, and I'm like, no, you don't have proof for that, actually. No, you don't have a valid argument for that, because everything that's ever been written in the Bible was by someone who was alive in the physical world. So you don't know that. You're making like a real big assumption about that. Okay, another one is, and I apologize if I'm just looking down, reading off this, but I want to make sure I'm getting these quotes right and not, misquoting Gregory here. But Barlaam says that this light was a sensible light, meaning sensible to the physical eyes, in the medium of air, appearing to the amazement of all, and then it was at once disappearing. One calls it divinity because it is a symbol of divinity. This is what Barlaam's saying. He's saying the light was just a symbol of divinity. It was through creative means. Of course, God, he's not affirming that God doesn't have glory in some way, but he's saying no, the physical light that they saw was a created light. It was through physical means. That's all he's saying here. And he says, what a novel opinion. This is Gregory. What a novel opinion. How can one speak of a sensible and created divinity which lasts only a day, appearing only to disappear on the same day? Rather, like these creatures one calls ephemeral, in fact, it lasts even less long than they do. Since it occurs and disappears in a single hour, it would be better to say it once appeared but never existed. Can this be the divinity which, without ever being the true divinity, triumphed over the venerable flesh akin to God? One should not say it triumphed for 1 minute, but does not so continually. For Gregory did not say having triumphed, but triumphing. And he's talking about the other Gregory here, the other defender of hesychasm, that is not only in prison, but is in the not only in person, but is also in the age to come. I apologize, I'm stumbling over my words here with fury. And this is just another ridiculous argument because of the fact that he says, what a novel opinion. And he talks about it lasting only a little bit of time. So he's saying, well, if it, what a weak divinity that you have in your mind, Barlaam, that it appears for a couple minutes and then disappears. Well, I actually flip that on you, Gregory. What a weak sense of divinity you have, because of the fact that you think the energies were so weak that they only appeared there for a couple minutes. God's so weak that the energies were only there for temporally, 3-4 minutes. And of course they're going to say, well, he showed them at the time and took them back. And okay, that's understandable, but that doesn't support Gregory's argument here against Barlaam. That's just a mute point that counters it out then. Yeah, and of course he critiques Barlaam here, but he doesn't understand what Barlaam's saying, because he talks about Barlaam having this weak idea of the divinity because of this. But no, Barlaam isn't saying it's the divinity at all. He's saying it's a created effect. So he doesn't even, I don't know if he doesn't understand what Barlaam's saying, or if he's purposely straw-manning Barlaam in this case, which it seems like he is sometimes, because that's clearly not what Barlaam's saying. Because Barlaam's saying, no, the essence energies are identical, and that these physical things that are being seen are created effects. Of course, created by God, but still through created mediums and creative effects. And Gregory Palamas is just plugging his ears and not listening to what Barlaam is saying whatsoever, in my opinion. And then he also says, but even if a man considers that everything that has a beginning is created, we for our part know that while all the energies of God are uncreated, not all are without beginning. Indeed, beginning and end must be ascribed, if not the creative power itself, then at least to its activity. That is to say, to its energy as directed towards created things. Moses showed this when he said God rested from all the works which he had begun to do. So this means, this is all Gregory Palamas is saying here, is that God isn't actively, showing the energy at all times. Of course, the energy is always working through the world and in the world, of course. But he's saying it's not actively showing it all the times. For example, the Taboric light. He doesn't, instead of showing the light for the rest of history, he decided to show it to the a couple apostles for just a couple minutes. Okay, that's fine. But then you critiqued Barlaam for saying what a weak divinity. But then when it comes to you explaining it, you say, oh yeah, he stopped doing it then. God decided, I'm just going to show for a couple minutes and then stop doing it. Okay, well then don't critique Barlaam for his perspective, because you have to deal with the same issue and yours isn't any better. So it doesn't prove his point whatsoever. And I think it makes him look intellectually weak in this area, in my opinion. Okay, sorry. Another quote is, and if someone says that this light is an independent reality, separate from the nature, so if these energies are separate from the essence, of him who would signify of whom it is only a symbol, then let him show where and of what kind this reality is, which is shown by experience to be unapproachable. And not only to the eyes, the disciples fell headfirst to the ground, we are told, and was shown forth only from the venerable face and body of Christ, for otherwise, if it were an independent reality, and by independent reality, he just means it's a created effect, eternally associated with Christ in the age to come, he would be composed to 3 natures and 3 essences, saying if this was an independent thing within Christ, that these energies were an independent thing within Christ, he would have the human nature, the divine nature, and the light nature, or whatever, you know what I mean? So I see what he's saying here, and that's clearly wrong, and I understand what he's saying here. And 3 essences, the human divine, and that of the light, so it is obvious and clearly demonstrated that this light is neither an independent reality, neither a created thing, nor something alien to the divinity itself. So here he's just saying, this isn't some third essence, some third nature. This is something that emanates out from the divine nature. That's all he's clarifying here. So here I'm not debating him on any things. I think his clarification of what's going on here is just, it helps make sense of other things. Something's wrong, of course, but that is his clarification on that. That is not a type of another nature or another essence. Okay, so I want to quickly go into the more Western, by Western here I'm talking about Roman Catholic perspective about the created graces. I don't know how much of Rome holds to this now. I know someone like Barlaam at the time of this was a very common practice because the scholastic Lutherans are arguing against it all the time. I don't know if Rome has a specific position on this, but through the created graces, this is something that St. Thomas talks about and the other scholastics talk about. So this is what they're arguing against here, and this is what the East still argues about when they promote the essence energies distinction. So just for clarification on the idea of God in the West says God's essence is equal to his existence, which is equal to his attributes, which is equal to his actions, to his energy. It's all equal. God is absolutely simple, and the difference here is saying, instead of the East where we have these not a separation, where we have this distinction between the essence and energies, but doesn't make it separate. In the West, we say, no, there's no distinction at all. It's all the same. We just as humans can't fathom it being different because of our tiny brains. Basically, we're not smart enough to fathom God in that way. So he's really he's the most absolutely simple thing. He's the most one thing. And we just interpret like those actions differently. Like if we talk about God's actions throughout history, we interpret them as being loving or wrathful or this or that, but there's not real distinctions because God's just pure act. So we just say there's no real distinction at all. We just interpret those things differently. And there is a sense of a kind of uncreated grace in the West, where it's just the indwelling of the Trinity within the person, which is, for all Christians, we all basically affirm that. That's not a specifically Roman Catholic idea. That is just a Christian idea. And then we have the idea of the created graces. This is how we receive the graces from God. This is also called a created habit by Thomas Aquinas. And this is a supernatural change of soul, so it's still divine in some way, but it's through a created medium, so we can receive it. And this is what makes us capable of living a type of divine life. How we really are sanctified and become more holy through these created graces from God. And this doctrine, once again, like how the essence energies distinction. It depends on another doctrine. For the East, their idea of the essence energy distinction comes from that real participation within God, which is most important to them. And in the West, our idea of the created graces comes from kind of the reverse order. It actually comes from our Trinitarian belief that God is absolutely simple and that he's absolute one, and that there is no distinction between the essence and the energy, so we can't really participate in that way. So it has to be through created graces that we end up receiving it. Obviously, as a Lutheran, I end up not taking the position of created graces. I would end up taking the position of someone like David Holatz. But we're not talking about Lutheranism here. We're talking about Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So I want to stay on topic, so this video is going to be long enough for you. And so the created graces is based on the pre-established idea that God is absolutely simple. And if we participate in his energies, we would then participate in the essence, which obviously can't be right, which is the thing that Barlaam critiqued the monks and Gregory for saying. So the grace we receive must be received through a physical created medium. So how does Western participation look like then? Well, we're really elevated. We're made holy by these created gifts and by the indwelling of the Trinity in us, like I said. And by the person's will being united to God. Not just being in alignment, but through the created graces being united to it. I think we can all kind of understand that in some way. And then in heaven, the intellect seeing or grasping God through the beatific vision. Of course, we don't see the very inner life of the Trinity, but we are able to, in heaven, not fully understand it, but we receive a created gift called, I'm trying to find where it calls, let me hold up before I get to that. So what is the beatific vision? This is an immediate knowledge of God and the direct unmediated sight of God's essence once we are in eternity in heaven with him. It does not mean seeing God with our physical eyes, seeing a body or shape or any type of image or symbol, but it means we intellectually perceive the divine essence. So how do we see this, though? Aquinas calls this lumen gloria. I apologize if I mispronounce that. I don't speak Latin. I apologize. Which is a special, once again, created gift that we receive. And in English, it's just called the light of glory. And it strengthens the intellect so that we are able to kind of apprehend God's essence. Once again, not fully seeing the inner life of the Trinity or fully grasping it, but we're able to kind of comprehend the essence. And there's another sun analogy. Apparently in the ancient world, they loved sun analogies for everything. And it says, if your eyes were built for something like candlelight, you couldn't stare directly at the sun. But if your eyes were strengthened by the sun itself, it was given it this, created gift, which is the lumen gloria. You could then see it. So this light of glory is strengthening the intellect. And I don't want to say intellect because I want to. By intellect, I don't really mean reason as much as maybe the word like nous. Nous may be a better word, and not in the very Platonic sense of it, but more in the Christian sense of it. Maybe in a similar way as the East ends up using nous. There's another analogy, which is an ocean analogy, which I think is quite good. When you look out the ocean, you can, of course, see the ocean, and you can truly experience it in its effect, but you cannot interact with the wholeness of it. So even in heaven, we cannot interact with the wholeness of the essence, but you're able to see it. But you wouldn't say, I see part of the ocean, because it's one ocean in that way. And of course, this is not don't get overly scientific about it, but I think through this analogy, you can kind of comprehend, okay, I can kind of see what they're saying. So in the beatific vision, the intellect and will rests in truth and in goodness. It is claimed that interaction is no longer through the mediated substance, though, such as the sacraments and the created graces. We truly see God's essence, once again, not in that physical, shapely physical substance way, but intellectually, we able to grasp it. And in the West, more of the mystical union and interaction of God is based on things like the sacraments, growth in holiness and love, of course, through the created graces, and aligning our will with God's will, and then the indwelling of the Trinity, and of course, ultimately, the beatific vision. Now that I think we've established some of the clarifications about the essence-energies distinction, and about the Western perspective about it, I wanted to go through and do some critiques I think I have about the essence-energies distinction, and why I didn't end up subscribing to it, because this was, at the end of the day, because I was a couple times I was really close to converting to orthodoxy, but the one thing that really prevented me, there were a couple things, but one thing that really stopped me was the essence-energies distinction, because I just think it is so clearly wrong, and I do think it's fairly absent from the fathers, and we'll talk about that after, but here are some of the arguments against it. Here's a really classical argument, and it's just, they say, any real distinction in God at all, substance and accidents, essence and energies, any distinction at all, risks a type of partialism. Not a partialism in the sense of 1/3 God for each of the persons, but a type of partialism where it's split God in half between the essence and the energies. I think this is one of the weaker arguments, but it's the classical argument. And of course, anyone who's Eastern Orthodox is going to say all these arguments are wrong and it's just a misrepresentation or a misinterpretation. But I've not seen any arguments that successfully argue against these in any way. And I'm trying, I'm trying to find real sources that argue against these, because especially at one time I really wanted to be Eastern Orthodox, and I couldn't find an argument that really convinced me of like, no, this is the right doctrine. It never happened. And then a couple of these are things that I've not found on the internet, but I myself through my philosophizing have I was like constructed, which I think are seriously problematic to the case. One of them is that since God is fully present in each of the energies, remember that was very important, that God is fully present in each of the energies, but the energies in themselves were different, I believe that it ends up saying in some way that there are differences in God, or that God is different in the sense of, since God is fully in the energies, but each of the energies is really distinct, well, that means that there's some type of differences in God, or else all the energies would be the same, which, if someone were to make that argument, I would be more accepting of that position, that the energies are all actually the same, but we interpret them differently. But that's clearly not what Gregory Palamas teaches. And that is not my opinion. That is historical opinion. And Gregory Palamas, what he says in the Triads, that is not his position, and that is not the position of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So if they were arguing in the same way as I talked about earlier, how in the West we interpret kind of God's emotions, where God doesn't have emotions, but how he acts in the world, we kind of describe certain things to him. If we did that with the energies, I think that'd be a lot stronger of a claim, and a lot more defensible one. I think it'd still be deeply flawed and wrong, but I think it would be at least better. But I think when we say the energies, which are fully God each, are different, I think you end up saying, yeah, there's differences in God. Not just how they interact in the world, but really substantially in God. One of them that we have a problem with, I already mentioned earlier, is that some of the energies came into being temporally. And the simple argument for this is, I can't think of anything that came into being temporally that isn't created. If you have something, please let me know. Something that came into being temporally that isn't created, because that's one of the things that are necessary for the energies. The most important thing are that they are uncreated. Now, here's the thing: if he says that, oh well, they only appeared there, like the light at Tabor, well, they only appeared there and then they not disappeared, but like they stopped being physically seen through the. I don't want to say through the medium, because that's not what I'm saying, but you know what I mean. If they stop just appearing to the eyes, and they're still there, okay, but that's not what Gregory Palamas is saying. He's saying, no, some of them come into being later on in time in some way. He's not fully clear on this, but it seems like there ends up being created things in God, which is clearly wrong, and I don't think that's what he's saying, but that's the inevitability of the argument. If you end up saying, well, some of them temporally come into being, there were created things in God then. Another thing is, I don't think it actually ends up solving the unknowability problem of God. I think what it does is it brings it up a peg. Where here's the West, and we say, well, we can't fully know God, so we receive him through these created gifts. I think what the East does is they say, well, no, we really do receive him, but we receive him through the energies, but we don't see the essence. So they're one peg above, but they don't solve the problem. And I think it's because it's a mystery. But what I think they do in trying to up that peg is they introduce all these other problems into the situation, and I think in some way they actually make it worse, because at least in the Western position of the beatific vision, we in heaven at least are some way through the created energies able to grasp God's essence, where in the East you never do that. Even in heaven, you do not grasp the essence. You only grasp ever the energies, and that's something that they are very confident and very strong in believing. So I think in some way they up the peg, but they also make God more unknowable by rejecting kind of the beatific vision in the West, where we say, well, no, we really do comprehend the essence. In the East, they say, no, it never happens. So I don't think it actually helps their argument at all for the knowability, unknowability of God. I think it just confuses things and introduces incorrect doctrines into the church. Another thing is, my next point was, I think it makes God unknowable, which I do think. I also think it ends up introducing some type of weird Neoplatonism, into God because it talks about the essence being greater than the energies. So I think in some way, because in the Neoplatonic chain of being, which I'm not very well read on, I'm not going to pretend, but it goes from the one, which Plato talks about, but Plotinus really explains the chain of being for what is now later Platonism or Neoplatonism, whatever you want to call it, where it's the one, and then it kind of overflows into the nous, which overflows into the soul, not the human soul, but just a soul, and then through that soul comes out human souls and created matter. So you kind of have this chain of being in Neoplatonism. I think in some way, when you say the essence is greater than the energies, you say two things. One, you end up saying that because God's fully in the energies, that somehow God is greater than God in the distinction, because you say God in his essence is greater than God in his energy. So you almost commit some type of, not partialism, you almost commit some type of, making God lower than God. What is the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry right now. But you end up making God somehow something that's fully God less than it. I understand why they have to end up making that the essence energies where the essence is greater than it, but I think it ends up still being problematic because it makes the energies which are fully God less than God in his essence. And the other thing is, I think it kind of comes out to be Neoplatonic in the sense of the essence kind of overflows. I don't say overflows, but you see what I'm saying? Like overflows into the energies, where it ends up being this kind of chain of being in God, where they're not going to say multiplicity, but I think it ends up inevitably being a type of multiplicity in God, where we have this eternal two-ness in a way, because the energies are eternally manifested or radiating off the essence. So I think it does end up making this eternal two-ness, and they're gonna say no, but I think any formal distinction, and God does end up doing that, and with the essence being fully God but also less than the essence, I think it does create a multiplicity in the Godhead, which I think is of course problematic. I also think in some way it falls up into this weird position of like the Greek philosophical debate of the one in the many. If you've read it all on philosophers, this is an endless argument that happens throughout all of Greek philosophy, where how is there this in nature, this one and this many? How does that work together? And you see people like Democritus and Luparius take the position of the many through the atomists, and you see people take the position of the one. People like not the Milesian school, the like people like Anaxagoras, people like give me 1 second. Okay, I apologize. I misspoke. So talking about the schools of like multiplicity, like oneness, ends up people being like, and I just have a book on philosophy, so I apologize. I had to check it. People like Heraclitus, people like Zeno, people in the Eleatic school, Parmenides, people, Xenophanes, people like that. And for the pluralists, they end up being people like Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and the atomists, which is Lupercalis and Democritus. I apologize. But I think it ends up committing this error in the sense of, since the energies are really distinct, follow me, the energies are really distinct from each other, we don't actually know how many energies there are. There could be endless energies. We don't know that. There's no concise list, and if every action in God it's not an interpretation that we look at it and say, oh, we interpret it to be this or that. It really is distinct. There ends up being possibly endless, infinite energies. So there comes from this oneness in essence, but this infinity in energies. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's never a clarification on how many energies there are. I don't know if there is, but there could be these endless amounts of energies. And because the energies are really distinct from each other, it creates this almost this infinity in God, but in the worst way possible. Not this infinity of he's so other, but this infinity of he has these distinctions that end up being, because the energies aren't just distinct from the essence, but they're distinct from each other. God ends up having endless possible distinctions within himself because the energies are really distinct from each other and there's possibly endless energies. Okay, and this is another very important part of the video. And this is about the church fathers' perspective on this issue. So I'm not going to lie to you. When I went into this, I was prepared to be completely wrong. I was completely ready to be awestruck. I was to be like, damn, I guess I can convert to Eastern Orthodoxy if they all say this. And so I read a number of the fathers. The fathers I did include here are Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, so the Cappadocian fathers, Saint Maximus. I end up having actually, hold up, sorry, a book that I borrowed from my college. I very much appreciate letting me borrow this to do some reading from Saint Maximus. I also did some reading of Saint John of Damascus, and then I also did some of Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, I believe. Hold on, let me check. Yeah, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem. I didn't end up for this getting able to read Athanasius because he has a billion treatises, and I was like, I've been working this video long enough. I need to end it at some point. And the other one was I didn't do Cyril of Alexandria, which also supposedly talks about the essence energy distinction heavily. But what I found was even more scandalizing. I think basically Gregory Palamas does actually become an innovator. Reading the fathers, how they speak about this distinction, if they even mean it as this, which I don't think a lot of them do, they do not talk about this in the same way Gregory Palamas does at all. Not even a little bit. And I think a lot of them that are said to talk about it, people, you know how you can control F and just type in a word? They're control Fing and they're like, see, he talks about the essence and the energies, and they don't even read the context of what the fathers are talking about. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all, but when reading them, I was so prepared to be like, do it, I'm wrong. And I was absolutely vindicated in my arguments. Because that's not how the fathers talk. Except for one, in my opinion. One, I think it's more clear that I think he does believe something along those lines. But the other ones, it's very clear it's not what they're talking about. So the most important ones, in my opinion, are going to be the Cappadocian fathers. What do they have to say? Because they're really early. And this is so key. And of course, the Eastern Orthodox Church is not going to say that there's development in doctrine. They should be, because so many people quote them on this, they should be promoting this. What they end up, and also just for context, if you want to read these and look through these as well, they don't just use the words essence and energies. For essence, also look for nature, substance, and for energies, also look for words like operation, activity, and work. So those are be key words in looking through this. And I look through every example of them talking about this in their letters and stuff like that. So St. Basil letter 234. This is a really big one, and a couple other the letters he talks about kind of the essence and the energies and stuff like that. He says this is a real distinction. I reject that vehemently. I think they're completely wrong in interpreting him like that. And I think in the same ways for Gregory Nyssa and for Gregory Nazianzus. In the West, we end up saying they're talking about epistemology, which in this case is, epistemology is knowledge, but in this case we're talking about knowledge of God and how we know God. And when you read the Cappadocian Fathers, before they talk about the distinction, before they talk about the essence and energies every time, the paragraph before, what are they talking about? Because we want to read things in context. So the paragraph before, they are always talking about, how do we know God? How do we have knowledge of God if we don't know the essence? You know, stuff like that. And of course, I'm talking about in this life. I'm not talking about like in the afterlife, because they're talking about debating people which are non-Christian, and they're saying, well, if you don't know the essence of God, how do you, in this life, how do you really know him at all? And they're talking about, well, we know him through his works in the world, which is something in the West, of course, we affirm. We say that the essence and energies are identical in God, because God's absolutely one. He's absolutely simple. But yeah, we know God through his works. In the Old Testament, in the New Testament, we know him through what he does. Of course, this is true. But before they ever talk about the essence and the energies, they end up prefacing it with basically saying, this is about how we know God acts in the world. And Basil, this is the most obvious. In letter 234 and like 236 and all that, it is very clear that this is what is going on. You can read it. I didn't quote the entire thing because it would just be me reading a paragraph here, which I do end up doing for later fathers. But it is very clear that he is talking about epistemology. And then he also talks about not knowing the inner life of God, which is, of course, something everyone affirms. For Gregory of Nazianzus, I'm just going to be honest with this one. I know people were talking about there being talks about this in his letters against Eunomius. I looked in all of them. I could not find where he talked about this type of distinction supposedly in the letters against Eunomius. I couldn't find it whatsoever. If someone knows, please comment. I would love to read that. And if I'm wrong, I will post a YouTube short to my channel critiquing myself and saying, no, he actually does talk about it here and here. But I'm going to say I don't think he does. And then he also says, so in his letter about the life of Moses, he talks about it's clear we can't gain knowledge of the divine essence by any creature or even the angels knowing. But this is a quote that he says, which I think is relevant. The divine one is himself the good. Key word, this is important. And then in quotations it says this, but this is what Gregory Nyssa wrote. In the primary and proper sense of the word, whose very nature is goodness. This he is, and he is so named, and is known by this nature. So here he's saying God's very nature of goodness. This isn't an energy. This is God's very essence. This is who he is. Which in the East, they end up saying the attributes are the energies. But no, God himself is the good, which is the Western position. And this is why the phraseology is so key here, because he's saying so he clarifies what he says. He says the divine one is himself the good, and then he says in the primary and proper sense. So he's saying the very essence of God is the good, is good. It's not an energy of God. So that I think is a very relevant point to what he's saying here. I did read a bit of Ambigum 7. And I'll be so honest, I was lost. If someone can get me someone who can interpret it and clarify that, I have the PDF on my computer. I read that and I was like, I don't know what's going on. I was confused. I'll be very honest. Okay, back to my stuff. Gregory Nazianzus, in Oration 28. This section, which I'll pull up for you. Give me 1 second. Okay, so here I have pulled it up. It is Oration 28 by Gregory Nazianzus, and section Roman numeral 17, I believe, XVII, if you want to look it up. And I'm on New Advent, and I'm just going to read off of here, so I apologize. I'm going to look away for a second. What God is in nature and essence, no man ever yet has discovered or can discover. Okay, true. Whether it will ever be discovered is a question which he who will may examine and decide. In my opinion, it will be discovered when that within us, which is godlike and divine, I mean our mind and our reason, the nous, shall have mingled with its like, and the image shall have ascended to the archetype of which it has now the desire. And this, I think, is a solution of what vexed the problem, as we shall know, even as we are known. But in our present life, all that comes to us is but of little influence, and as it were, a small influence from the great light. So here I think he's promoting a pseudo-beatific vision in the sense of, he's saying at some point we will know when our mind's been fully enlightened, Lumen Gloria, to be able to intellectually, with the nous, assent to the essence. So if anyone has known God or has had the testimony of Scripture to his knowledge of God, we are to understand such as one to have possessed a degree of knowledge which gave him the appearance of being fully more enlightened than another who did not enjoy the same degree of illumination. And this relatively superiority is spoken of as if it were absolute knowledge, not because it is really as such, but by comparison with the power of the other. So I'll just talk about, we do have some knowledge of God from Scripture and through his acts and history. Of course we do, but this is a relative knowledge, of course, being different from that which we will receive in heaven through the beatific vision of really contemplating with the nous, the essence. Okay. I apologize about that. I apologize for the edit, the cut to that, but I thought that was a very strong argument. And I think he does end up promoting a pretty strong position on what of it later to be a Western stance. Okay. So, and then St. Maximus the Confessor, he's a little bit stronger and clear on this. I think the Cappadocian Fathers, at the end of the day, the idea of the essence energy distinction in them, I'm going to say that's in the same way that Rome goes back in history and reads like the papacy into things and reads purgatory into things, I think the East is doing this with the essence energy distinction. Because I think if you come from the Eastern position and you read that, you can get it out. You can read the essence energy distinction into the fathers. Now, if I were to give the fathers to someone who was not that, would they read that there's a real distinction out of the fathers? I think certainly not. I think there's no chance they would ever think that there's this real distinction, because especially because almost all of them are talking about it being the knowledge of God, of it being, yeah, we have the knowledge of God through the energies that act in the world. Of course, God has energies in the West. We say the energies are identical to his essence, but of course God has energies because he works in the world. Of course he does. But they are not saying that there's some real distinction between them in God. They're reading that into it. I think that's pretty disingenuous. So St. Maximus the Confessor, on his chapters on knowledge, does present the idea, and I don't have quotes for him, because I was reading a bit of him, I was like, I just can't write down any more quotes, to be honest. I was getting a little tired. It does present the idea of the super essential nature, which is also in Pseudo-Dionysius. So he does present this idea that the essence really is, God's more than just that essence or substance. He's something so much greater that we can never know, of course. But everyone affirms that idea in some way. But in my opinion, and if we go back to earlier where Gregory Palamas quoted Maximus the Confessor, and I said it was confusing, here he says, beginning, middle, and end are characteristics of being distinguished by time. That refutes the idea of created energies, which is something that Gregory Palamas promoted. He does not promote that. So even if he, which I don't think he does, has this, and he does talk about the energies of God interacting in the world and being with the Spirit as it goes over the waters. And of course, he talks a lot about the energies because he's in the monothelitism, diothelitism debate, or apologize. He's not in that debate. He's in the debate about the oh no, maybe that is the right one. Oh God, he's in the debate that's happening with does Jesus Christ have two wills and two energies, or one will and one energy? What is going on with that? That's the debate that he's in. So he talks a lot about the energies, but he doesn't really ever cover this idea of there being a real distinction in God about that. Most of the time what he's covering is that, yes, there are two energies in essence. Two energies and two wills in Jesus Christ. But he doesn't really talk all that much about there being this real distinction, and that's how we interact with God through these uncreated energies. That's not in him really at all. And I think even if it is, even if you promote and say, even if you are a promoter of that and say it is, he definitely rejects the ideas that Gregory Palamas later develops about some being them temporally created in time. He totally rejects that idea, which is right of him to reject. Okay, and then we also have St. John of Damascus, who's going to be, the East is going to, I mean, everyone should love John of Damascus. He wrote amazing things against the Mohammedans. He wrote amazing things on icons. Very important church father. Everyone agrees. I was expecting him to be like real heavy on the essence energies. Once again, unfortunately, not really for the East. I'm sorry, guys. He really isn't. Okay, so I have a couple quotes of him that talk about a couple things, and we'll go over them. That God, who is invisible by nature, is made visible by his energies. We perceive from the organization and government of the world, and that's a quote from Wisdom 12:5. And that is, if you read the full quote in context, that is just epistemology. He is talking about who is made visible by his energies. Yeah, we know God through his energies and interactions of the world. Of course we do. Like that's how we really have any knowledge of God. It's what he shares with us and his workings in the world. So of course. And no one arguing that God doesn't reveal himself through his actions in the world. No one's saying that. He also talks about the superessentiality of God. Here's another quote which I've seen actually quoted by orthodox people saying, here it is, here it is. They didn't read the full quote though, and their argument doesn't make any sense. And this may be perceived throughout the whole of creation, but in the case of the holy and superessential and incomprehensible Trinity, far removed from everything, it is quite the reverse, for there the community and unity are observed in fact, through the co-eternity of the substances, and through their having the same essence and energies. Now, that might sound, okay, he's making this distinction between the essence and energies. They're not the same thing here. See, John of Damascus is saying that there's a real distinction in it. Because he talks about having the same essence and energies, then kind of not contrasting them, but saying these are two different things. Now, and I've seen Orthodox people do this, problem is they didn't read the literal next 5 lines in the quote. Because if you read it, it says, and through their having the same essence and energy and will and concord of mind. So if you're going to say, oh, he's making a real distinction here with the essence and energies, you also have to say he's also making a real distinction in God's will and concord of mind. So you actually have to end up saying that there's 4 distinctions in God, that being his essence, his energies, his will, and his concord of mind, or his place of mind. Because actually said that there's 4 different distinctions, not just the energy essence thing, that there's 4 of them, which of course everyone's Eastern Orthodox is going to reject, but it proves here that's not what he's talking about. You didn't read the next 5 lines of John of Damascus. That's the problem. You can't read. That's the problem. Yeah, and that's my critique of that line. They completely misunderstand what that line is talking about whatsoever, and they're saying, well, he's talking about two different things. Well, if he is, he's actually talking about 4 different things if you're going to interpret like that. But if you're going to interpret as God is absolutely divinely simple, and he's just talking about these different things because in our human minds we can't comprehend God's absolute simpleness, so we end up having these distinctions that aren't real distinctions, but just hypothetical ones to help us comprehend it. If you take that idea where they're just hypothetical to help understand God, perfectly fine. We do that all the time in the West. That's the only way we really understand God. If you're saying they're real distinctions, totally incorrect, and a totally incorrect interpretation of John of Damascus. Okay, another quote is, the deity is simple and uncompound, but that which is composed of many and different elements is compound. If then we should speak of the qualities of being uncreate and without beginning and incorporeal and immortal and everlasting and good and creative and so forth as essential differences in the case of God, that which is composed of so many qualities will not be simple, but must be compound. But this is an impious in the extreme. Now, of course, we're not going to say that God's, and they're not going to say the essence is that, but remember the fact that the energies are truly different from one another. They are truly different. And we're not talking about, here he's talking about being uncreated and without beginning and incorporeal, but things like good and creative and those things, they really are distinct. Those energies are really distinct from one another. And John of Damascus here is saying, well, if those qualities and attributes are really distinct from one another, then God is composed. And these qualities will not make him simple, but being a compound being. And this is impious and extreme. I agree with you, John of Damascus. That is impious and extreme and false. So but once again, this problem is solved if you say the energies are all the same and we interpret them differently. Once again, this is fine. But this is not what the East says. That's not the position of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and that's why it is wrong. I think the other position is wrong as well, but I think this is just more wrong, saying that all the energies are different from one another. Okay. I apologize. Okay, here's another quote. But observe that although we hold that the natures of the Lord permeate one another, yet we know that the permeation springs from the divine nature. For it is that... Sorry. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. This is another line I've seen used by Orthodox people to make this distinction, but that once again, they've not read it in the full context. For if the Son imparts to us his energies, and yet does not participate in ours, how much the rather must it be true of the Creator and the Lord of the Son? So let's talk about the analogy of the Sun again with the essence and energies thing, supposedly, from the East perspective. But they use this as saying, well, see, he's talking about the energies, like the rays from the sun, being different from the essence. Once again, not what he's talking about. If we go back to the beginning, which I started to say beforehand because I forgot my notes, here we go. But observe that although we hold that the natures of the Lord permeate one another, yet we know that the permeation springs from the divine nature. For it is that penetrates and permeates all things as it wills, while nothing penetrates it. And it is too that imparts to the flesh its own particular glories, while abiding itself impossible and without participation in the affections of the flesh. For it is the Son that imparts blah, 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 blah. Here what he's talking about the two natures of Christ and how there's a glorification of the human nature because of being hypostatically connected or hypostatically united with the divine nature. He's not talking about an essence energy distinction. He's talking about the two natures of Christ. And this idea, which as a Lutheran I love, I'm going to be like, hell yeah, brother, that the divine nature permeates the human nature and glorifies it. And that's how, like, as in the Lutheranism, in Lutheran tradition, we say that's how Christ's physical body is capable of being everywhere, because it's permeated by the divine nature and attributes, and not attributes, and through the divine nature, it's able to do things that a normal physical body wouldn't be able to, such as being in the Eucharist everywhere in the world every Sunday. So once again, a total misinterpretation of St. John of Damascus. Just not what he's saying. Here we go. So, and then here's another thing that, this is just a clarification that I wanted to write. It is a common Western argument to say that it is a conceptual distinction and not a real one. So we're talking about how a lot of these fathers are talking about the essence energies, quote unquote, distinction, but what they're really doing is they're trying to explain God's operation in the world. And it's easier to explain that when you make this hypothetical distinction of his essence and his energies, who God is and who he acts in the world. They're not saying that there's in my opinion, and I think with the support of the fathers and the arguments, that they're not making this real distinction that Gregory Palamas does, but they're making this hypothetical one to help explain. Because think about it, he's also explaining this, writing this to people that are, the world isn't Christianized at this point. They don't understand a lot of still what's going on. Obviously, he's in the 8th century with the Second Council of Nicaea, but the world isn't fully Christianized yet. He's writing to people that aren't Christian. He's writing to people that don't agree on a lot of things. There's still a bunch of heretics at this time. There's still a bunch of iconoclasts and monothelites and all these different groups that he's writing about. And he lives at a time, and this was right after the 5th and 6th century, where the councils, there was a lot of division because of the councils that St. Maximus was at, about the two wills and the two energies. And a lot of his writing about the energies does end up talking about, because Christ has two natures, he has two energies. So he was still on the front line arguing and debating about the two energies. So a lot of times when he's talking about the energies, he's talking about them in Jesus Christ having the divine energy and the human energy. A lot of times he's not even talking about this divine energy that's supposedly distinct from the divine essence. No, he's talking about the 5th and 6th ecumenical council, because those were still debated topics that people do not widely accept. So most of the time when he mentions the essence energies, he's simply talking about one of two things. God being united in the energies. He talks a lot about God being united in will and in essence and in energies and in glory and in all these things. And the other one is Jesus Christ having two energies. Okay, here is another quote of him. All the faculties we have already discussed, both these of knowledge and those of life, both the natural and the artificial, are, it is to be noted, called energies. For energy is the natural force and activity of each essence. Or again, natural energy is the activity innate in each essence. And so clearly, things that have the same essence also have the same energy. And things which have different natures also have different energies. For no energy which can be devoid of a natural, for no essence can be devoid of natural energy. And I agree. You can't have God as pure essence. Of course, we would say the essence and energy are the same in God because he's absolutely simple in the West. But what we're saying is, yeah, God, of course God has energies because he does things in the world. You can't have this energyless essence. What would that even be? That would be nothing. So that's what he's saying here. All he's saying is you can't have an essence without an energy, which everyone affirms, but people misinterpret this and to say, well, in here he's saying there's this real distinction between the essence and the energies, and he's just clarifying that, well, no essence can be without the energies, and they're assuming because he's saying that he's making this real distinction, which he definitely isn't. He definitely isn't saying that, or if they're reading that into in what he's saying. They're taking their position and reading it into the fathers instead of seeing what do the fathers really have to say about this issue, which I think is extremely problematic. And then the last father if there is one father who I think would actually be holding to Gregory Palamas' position, I think it would be St. Cyril of Jerusalem. I think he does lean more in that way. And I don't think fully, but I think he leans more that way than anyone that we've previously mentioned. To be honest, I don't think any of these people hold to the palamite distinction. I don't think they do hold the real distinction. And if not, I would have to see significant evidence that they really do. Because none of that was convincing. None of what I read from the fathers was a convincing argument as to that being a real distinction. Some of it was really convincing evidence that absolute divine simplicity is correct, actually. Okay, but going to St. Cyril of Jerusalem, I think he's the strongest case. And here is in his letter 6. For devotion, it suffices us simply to know that we have a God who is one, a living and ever-living God, always like himself, who has no father, and not talking about the person of the Father, but saying he doesn't have a creator, none mightier than himself, no successor to thrust him out from his kingdom, who is in name is manifold, in power infinite, in substance uniform. For though he is called good and just and almighty, he is not on that account diverse and various, but being one and the same. He sends forth countless operations of his Godhead, not exceeding here and deficient there, but being all things like himself. And I think the key word here that really makes this is sending forth countless operations. So I think he does end up saying, well, God is one, but he has these endless operations that he's sending forth in the world, which are truly distinct from one another, and being fully present in the energies, not exceeding here and deficient there, but being all things like himself, all these energies and operations in the world being fully him. So I think this is a really strong case that he probably would lean more in that direction. And then he also says, would you learn that to comprehend the nature of God is impossible, so leaning more to the Eastern idea that there's only this participation in the energies and never this contemplation of the essence in heaven with the nous. And that seems to be maybe kind of an early critique of the beatific vision in a way, or pseudo idea of that, because that idea is obviously not fully fledged out in the 5th century or 4th century, you know what I mean? So overall, I really don't think the fathers do promote this idea of a real distinction. Of course, the Eastern Orthodox apologists and people that react to this, if anyone does, they're going to say, basically, I misinterpreted Gregory Palamas, I misinterpreted his arguments, I misinterpreted the fathers, I misinterpreted what they were saying. Basically, that because I don't have the sea of apostolic tradition, reading it through the correct lens of history, which of course is their position, that I basically can't understand any of this, and I can't comprehend any of it. But I just don't take that as a valid argument. If your position is so clear and so true, it should be seen very obviously in the fathers, and it just really isn't. It really isn't. Of course, I'm not saying that there isn't clarification of doctrine. Of course there is. Of course there's clarification. At the Council of Chalcedon explain the two natures, not everyone up to that was up to explain that. Some people were leaned more on one nature, or like a Miaphysite position, what's a compound nature of the two natures. So it takes time to clarify. But I think that's a significant difference from what they're saying to what Gregory Palamas is saying. And I don't think they're the same thing. And I don't think they're even close, besides maybe St. Cyril of Jerusalem. And I was really surprised in this. I truly was, because I was expecting to go into reading this and being like, oh, they really do lean that way. They really do lean that way towards the essence energy distinction. I would have to, in a way, kind of argue from the Western fathers. But I didn't have to do that. These are all fathers that are, some of them are very Greek. St. John of Damascus, Maximus, the Cappadocian fathers, they're both Eastern and Western, but the Greeks love them. And they just do not support the essence energy distinction as it being a real distinction. If you want to talk about hypothetical distinction, we can talk about that. But they simply don't promote that idea, or if they do, they never wrote about it. Or they, or you can have this position, I guess, of, well, they're the same church, we're the same church as the fathers, if, the Orthodox saying this, we're the same church as the fathers, and we've always believed the same thing, so therefore they must have believed this. But I don't believe that's a convincing argument. I don't believe that you're the same church as the fathers, so this is an unconvincing argument. And I really think this is problematic. I do really think it's a really problematic doctrine for the reasons I listed, with that kind of Neoplatonic influence of kind of a multiplicity in some way, and of the essence being greater than the energies, but the energies being truly God, and about how there's kind of an endless amount of energies in the same way, and then being really distinct, but even though God's fully in each of the energies, they are really distinct from each other, which I think creates differences in God. I do think a lot of these are really problematic ideas. And even the idea of that kind of pseudo-partialism I talked about, where it's not a partialism of the three persons, them each being one half God, but kind of this partialism of splitting God in half into being a one half essence, one half energies in a way. Which I think, I think it's a weaker critique of it, but I do think it still has some validity to it. But I wanted to make this video because I, for a long time, really consider Eastern Orthodoxy. And I really like a lot of aspects of them, and I love a lot of the saints, and I love a lot of their descriptions. And I think, especially as Lutherans and High Church Protestants, we see so many problems in Rome, and we look at the East and we say, they don't have those problems. But they have different problems. And in my opinion, I think some of the problems are even worse in the East than in the West. And that's why I wanted to make this video, because there's so many people that look to Orthodoxy and say it is this pure version of Christianity. It is this Christianity that was before the Roman kind of inventions of purgatory and the papacy and all these things. But no, they have their problems in themselves. They have serious problems with their doctrines of God. They have serious problems with this essence energy distinction. They have a serious problem of claiming to be in the fathers and what the fathers taught, but when examination of the fathers comes, them not being able to be found at all. I think it's a serious problem, and I just wish more people were able to at least know that going into it. I wanted to go into this being like, I was totally wrong and I convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. I love so many things about the Eastern Church. But when you read the fathers, when you think about this philosophically, they don't have a strong case. They really don't. And I think at the end of the day, even though the East will say I'm lying, Gregory Palamas is an innovator. These doctrines and the way that he promotes them are not in the fathers. And I know that sounds harsh, and I know that sounds rude to say, but I'm being honest here. I didn't come on here today and record this hour-long video to sit here and lie to you. And I'm not even saying, oh, you should become Lutheran. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, these things they're not true. And there's so many Eastern apologetics nowadays that try to minimize it, or try to make it understandable in some way. And what they really do is they're not making it understandable. They're retracting stuff that Gregory Palamas has said to make it more comprehensible for the Western listener. And that's not genuine. That's not how we should do apologetics if we're going to do them. So I wanted to make this a video because I see so many people, young people coming to Eastern Orthodoxy. And if you truly believe that's right, then of course go through it, that you're still a brother and sister in Christ. And I want you to attend church, regardless if you become Eastern Orthodox or Presbyterian or Roman Catholic or Old Catholic or Assyrian Church of the East or Oriental Orthodox or Methodist or Anglican. I want you to be in the body of Christ. That's what I want for you most. but I want you to be in something that's true and supported by the fathers. And I think to not make this video would be kind of disingenuous in a way. But if you have made it to the point in this video, I want to say thank you very much. I know this video is longer and it was maybe more philosophically heavy and more time of me just reading a paper off, and I apologize. I know it's not the most interesting. That's not what I enjoy the most. I don't just like sitting here reading and then looking up to you guys every 3 seconds to know I'm still there. I don't enjoy that, but I want to make sure that I'm getting these quotes right and that I'm truly understanding them and presenting them in a way which does make sense to you guys, because I think this is a heavier topic, and I want to present it in the clearest way I can possible, so I hope I was able to do that. Thank you very much for watching this video. I know it's been a while since I've made my last video. I've been kind of putting off things, but I've been doing a lot of reading about the essence energies distinction, reading a lot about the Trinity. I have my own book of Concord now that I'm reading. I'm reading more of of Greek philosophy, especially in the book that I showed off. And I've been doing a lot more reading into Lutheran positions and the Eastern positions and even Roman Catholicism with the created grace and the beatific vision. So I apologize I've not been able to produce as much content. I hope going forward I'm able to. And I still have that video by Eastern Orthodox councils, which I have ended up putting off. The video is basically done. I just haven't recorded that because I'll be honest, I've been neglecting uploading, and I apologize about that. And I am a little nervous to upload sometimes just because I'm still a young person. I don't like to get hate on my videos, but of course I have to realize that's just an inevitability. And I think at this point I've got enough hate on my videos and critique on my videos where I'm just like, don't care, send it. But once again, thank you all very much for watching. I very appreciate you being here. If you did like the video, like it. If you didn't, dislike the video. If you have anything you want to say or share or questions, please leave it in the comments below. And also there was one commenter who talked about considering becoming Eastern Orthodox or Lutheran. And I hope this video for you, I'm not trying to push you to one side or the other, but I hope this at least was informative and gave you something to think about when considering denominations. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate you all. And I hope you have a good rest of your week, your day, your month, your year, whatever timeline you're watching this in. I hope this was informative, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.